Okay, one last video lecture for today. There's actually, so I've put together a PowerPoint, one more PowerPoint for this material. There's quite a few slides on it, but I intend to really zip right through them. In fact, I was toying around with the idea of just uploading the PowerPoint for you to look at rather than turn it into a lecture, but I thought some of this stuff needs clarification and commentary. But even so, I'm really going to try to get through it quickly so this video isn't quite as long as some of the others. What this is going to be about is some basic principles of logic and principles of argument and reasoning. This is, I think, really crucial material. Some of it's a little bit tricky and a little bit tedious. We're just really skimming the surface here in terms of logic. I'm just going to be introducing some very basic logical concepts. Even though they're basic, among the most basic, they're still a little bit difficult. So don't beat yourself up over it if it's a little hard to get the jargon down and some of the concepts, but I really do feel like this stuff's crucial for any philosophy class. I always start out a philosophy course this way because there's going to be all kinds of opportunities to be evaluating arguments, and we need to have the technical vocabulary in place to be able to accurately diagnose what's wrong with an argument or what's right about an argument, and without having exposure to the material that we're going to be discussing presently, it would be really hard to do that. So try to stay with it here, and I think you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly. So, okay, if I can pull it up. Here we go. So first, actually, I should backtrack a little bit. What I want to just start off with is some general remarks about philosophical methodology. So basically, I mean, at the most fundamental level, as philosophers, what we're concerned with is assessing the degree to which certain beliefs are worth having. So because any belief that's really worth having is a belief that has a good argument in favor of it, that means that we're going to be concerned with evaluating or analyzing arguments for beliefs in order to determine whether they are beliefs that are worth having. Hope that makes sense. So when we say arguments here, I don't mean yelling kind of arguments, but the logical kind. Okay, so as philosophers, you're going to be devising arguments to support some belief or claim that you have, and evaluating other philosophers' arguments in order to determine whether their claims are worth believing. So you're going to be doing you're going to be doing these things, actually both of these things, and not only your paper writing, but also in your discussion posts, I hope. So when you're reading a philosophy essay, this is the way you should think about it. You're not simply trying to glean facts from the reading in the way that you would if you're reading a science textbook, but you're also going to be tracing the steps in an argument that the philosopher is making so that you can figure out what the conclusion is that the author wants to prove and whether she succeeds in proving it. So it's important that you take your time, because as I've indicated already, philosophy could be difficult, so rushing or cramming isn't going to help. Read slowly and deliberately. Reading an article more than once won't hurt, although I understand it's not likely that you'll have a chance to do that. But if you do read it only once, you should at least take notes and highlight important passages, because that will help. The first thing that you're going to want to do is to to identify the conclusion the author is trying to establish. Okay? Figure out what it is they're trying to prove or trying to convince you of. But then you got to determine the premises, the supporting evidence that the author uses to support that conclusion. Okay? So once you've done that, you've got to figure out whether there's the appropriate kind of connection between the supporting evidence and the conclusion. In other words, do these premises actually do they provide good reason to believe the conclusion? That's where the evaluation comes in. Evaluating an argument goes above and beyond just understanding the argument. The evaluation part is this convincing, right? So, two parts then. Understanding the argument, figuring out what it is the philosopher's claiming, but then also evaluating the argument. Is this argument convincing? Right, making an informed judgment about what you've read, developing your own opinion. However, I want to clarify that opinion here doesn't mean mere opinion. Okay? The idea in philosophy is to back one's opinion up with reasons. So anytime you find yourself giving an opinion in a paper or in a discussion post, it's best not to just say, well, this is what I believe, right? But why? Okay, I hinted at this a moment ago, but just to make it explicit, this evaluation aspect, evaluating an argument, involves two things. First is determining whether the author's conclusion follows from the premises. Okay, so do the premises, if they're true, would they provide strong support for the conclusion? And then also, are those premises actually true? That's a separate question. Because it could be the case that if the premises were true, that would provide strong support for the conclusion. But maybe the premises are actually false. So these are two separate matters. I encourage you to review this slide. In fact, to review all the slides in this first part of the lecture to make sure this all makes sense about the distinction here on this slide, for example, between A and B. The key point is that only when you can answer yes to both A and B, only then can you say that the author's conclusion is worthy of your acceptance. So, if either A or B, if you have to answer no to either A or B, then you should reject the author's conclusion. So that is if the premises seem false or if the conclusion just doesn't follow from the premises, then there's no reason to accept the conclusion. I'm going to give you some examples shortly, but just a brief digression. So I want to talk a little bit about paraphrasing and summarizing. These are going to be important tools for you, especially when writing papers, but also in other elements of the course. So here's one way of defining paraphrasing. It's just rewriting the text that you've read. So accurately capturing the original text meaning, but doing so in your own words. This is a surprisingly tricky skill to really hone and to get down. But it's crucial in writing philosophy papers. You don't want your paper to just consist of huge block quotes. You don't want to quote a philosopher every other sentence or quote a philosopher's entire paragraph. It's much better if you can summarize it, right? So you read it, figure out what it means, and then rephrase it, put it in your own words. Summarizing is distilling the main ideas of an article or essay to a small number of words. Of course, these two concepts go hand in hand. And here's the benefit of them. You're going to understand more of what the author says just by doing this task. You might not believe me, but you really do. I've written quite a few philosophy papers in my day, and I can attest to the virtues of these two activities. You'll understand a lot more if you actually make an effort to paraphrase and summarize. Okay, and then when it comes to writing papers and exams, I guess actually you won't have exams here, but rather quizzes, I'm going to be expecting that you're summarizing someone's argument, paraphrasing it, rather than just quoting it verbatim. So you might as well start getting this ability, getting some practice down with this ability right off the bat. Do, however, make sure that you're always indicating that you're summarizing someone else's view and not just leaving it ambiguous as to whether it's your own or someone else's thoughts. And then the same goes for direct quotations. You need to always cite references. I'm not picky about what citation method you use, just as long as it's clear, that things are in quotes and so forth. Okay. This slide really just echoes sentiments I've already expressed. If you want to pause it and read it, that's fine, but I'm moving on. It is important, however, to recognize that even, well-renowned philosophers like Aristotle or Plato can be wrong. So this evaluation aspect involves, you determining whether an author is right or wrong based on how well you think their argument works. You're going to do that by giving reasons for thinking that their argument does or doesn't work. It won't suffice just to say that it does work or that it doesn't. You need to give reasons. So I'm going to be doing two things when I'm grading your papers. First, I'm going to be looking to make sure that you've correctly summarized the person that you're writing on, but then also, when it comes to the part of your paper where you're giving your own evaluation or analysis, I'm not going to be looking for a correct answer there. I'm going to be looking to see how well you defend your own opinion, how strong or convincing the reasons are that you provide in support of your position. So you do need to read this document. I've uploaded guidelines on writing philosophy papers. Do that today. You're going to have a paper in just a few days as your first paper, so do this immediately. I'm going to make some notes, or I'll comment on it briefly in a couple of days, but you need to read that ASAP. Okay, so now a very brief introduction to logic. Picking back up where we left off a bit earlier, talking about premises and conclusions and so forth. Here's a nice quote from Louis Vaughan. He says that to read and write philosophy is to read and write arguments. Learning the fundamentals of logical argument, then, is a prerequisite for making sense out of philosophy and writing good philosophy papers. That, after all, is why we're taking the time here to talk about logic and arguments. So, first a definition, a statement. All right? Statements are going to be what arguments consist of. An argument is going to include premises and a conclusion, and both the premises and the conclusion will be statements. And a statement is something that asserts that something is or is not the case. Statements are either true or false, and here are some examples. I'm teaching a philosophy class right now. My dog is named Indiana. Incidentally, he is. 2 + 2 = 4, and humans evolved from penguins. Clearly false, but still a statement. These aren't statements. That's a question, so is that. That's a sort of imperative and an exclamation. None of those are statements. And since they're not statements, they're not the kinds of things that can be true or false. I mean, think about it. If I say, hurry up, that's not true or false. It doesn't have a truth value. Here's another quote from Vaughan, echoing what I just said. An argument is a combination of statements. Some of them are intended to support another one of them. So, some statements in an argument are intended to provide reasons for believing that another statement is true. So, the statements supposedly providing the support are known as premises. The statement being supported is known as the conclusion. I hope this makes sense. Now, a conclusion supported by strong premises, or convincing premises, is worthy of strong acceptance. A conclusion supported, by contrast, by only weak premises deserves weaker acceptance. Let me give you some examples of arguments. Here's the first. Nothing is better than a good Pinot Noir. My instructor says so. Wait. Second, if UA wins the next game, there will be a riot in my living room. UA will definitely win, so the riot is a sure thing. 64% of all people on campus are students. Yael is on campus, so she's probably a student. And finally, one that may be familiar to you already, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore he is mortal. Alright, so all four of these are arguments. As you can tell, every component of each of the arguments is a statement. Take number 1, for example. Nothing is better than a good Pinot Noir. That's a statement. It's either true or false. My instructor says so is a statement, and that's either true or false. So what I want to do here is try to label the premises and conclusions in each argument. I'm going to do the first one right now. What do you think the premise is here? I mean, there's two statements, so there can only be one premise and one conclusion. Which is the premise and which is the conclusion? Well, it seems that nothing is better than a good Pinot Noir is the conclusion. That's what the person who makes this argument is trying to convince you of. What support do they give, and what reason do they give in support of that conclusion? What is the premise? Well, just that my instructor says so. Maybe that's a bad reason to believe that nothing is better than a good Pinot Noir, but that's the reason given by this argument. And I've got that labeled like this. Now, what I want you to do is, in a moment, to pause this video and try to label the premises and conclusions in the three remaining arguments. Wait until I put them back up, and then pause it. So here's 2, 3, and 4. I want you to, just for your own edification, and this is important, I assure you, for what follows in this course, make sure you can successfully label the premise and conclusion in each of these arguments. So this is how it should look again, going back to 1. Label the conclusion in front of the statement that is the conclusion, and the premise in front of the statement that is the premise. So go ahead and pause the video now and do that. Okay, this is the correct labeling for the second argument. The conclusion, the thing that it makes most sense to think that the person who makes this argument is trying to convince you of, is that there's going to be a riot, right? These two premises here, if they're true, provide strong support for this conclusion. Take a moment to see why that's so. Suppose that this premise is true and this premise is true. Doesn't it seem like the conclusion has to be? The third argument, the conclusion is that Yael is probably a student. The first two premises provide strong support for that. You know, almost 2/3 of all people on campus are students, this claims. So if that's true, and if it's true that Yael's on campus, it seems at least more likely than not that she's a student. And that's what this conclusion says. She's probably a student. And then finally, sort of classical example used in logic courses throughout time. Conclusion is that Socrates is immortal. The reason we should believe that is that, 1, all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man. So if these are true, it's simply got to be the case that Socrates is mortal. All right. The point I want to make with this slide is just that arguments come in all shapes and sizes. So the conclusion can come before the premise, after the premise. We make arguments all the time in our everyday lives, trying to convince people of other things, and they're very varied in their form. You can take a minute to pause and read this if you'd like. Okay, here's some tips for figuring out what the premise is in an argument and what the conclusion is. Usually a conclusion is indicated by one of these words, although it doesn't have to be. If you just look back at some of those examples, I don't recall, but I think there might be some exceptions where none of these words are used, but these are good indicators. And these words often indicate a premise. So pause that if you like, but let's move on. Okay, so strictly speaking, there are two different kinds of arguments, although we're mostly going to be talking about only one of them, and that's deductive arguments. Now, if a deductive argument works, if it succeeds, it's supposed to provide logically conclusive support for its conclusion. If it actually does do that, then we'll say the argument is valid. If it doesn't If the argument does not provide logically conclusive support for the conclusion, then the argument is not valid or invalid. So, more on the definition of these technical terms, valid and invalid, shortly. Here's one way of illustrating it with a diagram. There's two kinds of deductive arguments, valid and invalid. And the valid ones are the good ones. Those are the ones that are good arguments, because if you accept the premises, it'd be irrational not to believe the conclusion. Invalid ones are ones that don't have that feature of being airtight. They're not necessarily all bad arguments. Some of them may still be persuasive, but it's possible to accept the premises and still reject the conclusion. Now here's the definition of what it means for an argument to be valid. Please pay careful attention to this. If an argument is valid, then this is the case. If the premises are or were true, then its conclusion absolutely must be true as well. You should pause the video at this point and read that a few times. In other words, in a valid argument, it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. I think if you read this here, which I'm drawing attention to with cursor, you'll see that it is equivalent to this. One way it's often put is to say that a valid argument is one where the conclusion follows from the premises, follows necessarily. Now, one important remark is that the term valid, as we're using it here, is a technical term in philosophy and logic. The term does not mean true. So you can think of cases where people say things like, oh, that's a valid argument, or that's a valid point. What a person means when they say that in ordinary language is something like, yeah, that seems correct, that's true, or that's right. That's not what the term means here. The word valid means, as a description of an argument, just as this. So, here's an argument. All soldiers are brave. Roy is a soldier, therefore he is brave. So that argument's valid. Why? Because if these premises are true, then the conclusion must be. Think about it. Would it be possible for these premises to be true and that conclusion false? No, right? If these were true, this would have to be true as well. However, this first premise, all soldiers are brave, is not true. I mean, one would imagine there are some soldiers that aren't brave. Although most, I'm sure, are, there are going to be exceptions. So this is actually false, but it's a valid argument because if this were true, and if this were true, this would have to be. Okay. I'm going to skip this slide. I'll put it up in case you want to pause it and review it, but I want to get this moving a little bit faster, so I'm going to skip this now. And likewise for this slide, but pause it if you'd like. Okay, so I hope you've gathered that one prerequisite for a good argument is that it needs to be valid. It needs to be the case. If an argument's going to be an argument at all, the premises had better provide support for the conclusion if the premises are assumed to be true. I mean, maybe they're not actually true, but it better be the case that if they were true, that would at least give us some reason to believe the conclusion. But obviously that's not all, because so far it's perfectly consistent with everything we've said for a valid argument to have false premises. We've just defined a valid argument as one where if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be. But we want more than that for a really good argument, right? We want the premises to actually be true in order for the argument to be at all convincing. What we'll call an argument that is valid and the premises are all true, We'll call that kind of argument sound. That's the technical term for that sort of argument. Now, if one of the premises of the argument is false, then the argument is unsound. Okay. So here's a valid argument. All bachelors are unmarried men. Matt Schuler is a bachelor. Therefore, Matt Schuler is an unmarried man. Why is that argument valid? Because if these premises are true, then this has to be. Is it also sound? Well, now you need to ask yourself, are these premises actually true? As it turns out, yes, they are. This is true, and so is this. So it's a valid argument and a sound one. Now here's another valid argument. All bachelors are married men. Matt Schuler is a bachelor, therefore Matt Schuler is a married man. Why is this argument also valid? Because if these two premises were true, this would have to be. But obviously, premise 1 is false. That's not what a bachelor is. So that argument's not sound because it has a false premise. Actually ignore this point here. That's going to that's not quite right, and it's just going to lead to confusion, this bottom bullet. But this bullet, actually beneath it, is certainly correct. We only take sound arguments to be strong arguments. If it's got a false premise, it's essentially worthless. Alright, so here's just a bit of summary as we wrap things up. For an argument to be valid, its premises don't have to be true. This is what makes an argument valid. Pause that if you'd like, but I would like to move on. And here's a way of diagramming it. I think this is actually quite helpful to see it visually like this. So you may want to pause this too to review it. I don't have anything to say about this though. Here's another way of putting it. And then an important observation to make is that an invalid argument is always unsound. Why? Well, here's how a sound argument gets defined. A sound argument is one that is valid, A, and has true premises, B. So, if the argument's invalid, it can't be sound, because one of those two conditions has already been violated. You can't have a sound argument that's invalid. And another way of illustrating all of this visually, I'll leave it to you, I'll leave it to your discretion, whether you feel like you need to review this. And that's it for our sort of brief primer on logic. I've got a handout that I'm going to upload in the next day or two so that you can test your hand at some of these and see how well you think you grasp these logical concepts, which, if you continue on in philosophy, are going to be crucial, and even for this course are going to be very helpful if you feel like it's possible for you to spend a little bit of time and master those concepts, validity and soundness, which I will acknowledge can be a little tricky. Usually in an in-person class when I administer a quiz on this material, which I won't be giving to you, people tend to do quite poorly, indicating that it takes some work to really have a good grasp of what these different terms and concepts mean. What I want to wrap this up with, and then we'll be done for the day, is some logical fallacies. This is another way of sort of getting our hands dirty and reasoning and argument. So, what is a logical fallacy? Well, it's a bad argument, among other things. Unfortunately, these kinds of arguments, fallacious arguments, are relatively common. it's important that you be able to spot these kinds of bad arguments so that you can notice them when philosophers make them. Also, it'll just help you in general in your life realize when somebody's trying to convince you of something that is totally bogus. So, just tying this back to what we just talked about, one thing we can say about fallacious arguments, or arguments that commit logical fallacies, is that they're invalid arguments. And as I just pointed out, if an argument's invalid, it's also unsound. Do take note of this remark down here. I won't bother to comment on it. Okay, what I want to do, if you'll excuse me, I need to take a drink of water. What I want to do is talk about some different kinds of logical fallacies. This will go much quicker than what we've been talking about before. But this is actually fun, I think, and interesting, and believe it or not, will pay off in some small way in your everyday life. So here's the first kind of logical fallacy I want to discuss, and it's called the fallacy of accident. An argument makes this fallacy when it makes generalizations that disregard exceptions. So here's an example. Cutting people is a crime. Surgeons cut people, therefore surgeons are criminals. That's a bad argument, right? Because in general this seems true, and that's true, but this argument, in making this conclusion that surgeons are criminals, disregards the exception that sometimes cutting people is not a crime. Now, one thing I should say up front is that many of these fallacies, the examples I'm going to give, are just obviously bad arguments. Okay, that's the way to illustrate these fallacies, is to use examples that are just totally obvious that they are bad arguments. But one thing that you'll notice, I hope, as the course progresses, is that people are much more apt to make these kinds of fallacies in less obvious contexts. And if you're not careful, they'll trick you into believing something like this on the basis of support like this, and it just won't be as obvious that the argument's horrible. Okay, second, appeal to authority. This is probably familiar. It's when a person says, well, X says Y, there's something positive about X, so Y must be true. So here's some examples. This must be true. After all, my teacher said it, and that's a respectable authority. My parents said it, a war hero said it, Jesus said it, Aristotle said it, it was written in the Bible or in a textbook. Appeals to authority are bad. I'll leave it to you to think about why. An ad hominem fallacy means an attack or appeal to the person, an attack on the person as opposed to the person's argument. So here, this person made this argument. There's something negative about that person, so their argument must be bad. It's kind of the converse, if you think about it, of the argument from authority. And here's an example. You shouldn't believe Paul's religious views. He doesn't even have a job. That's an attack on Paul rather than his views, and it doesn't seem like a good reason for rejecting his views. An appeal to the masses is an argument that aims to support some position solely by appealing to the popularity of that position. So, since 92% of all people believe in UFOs, they must exist. Here's one that's sort of interesting, a little bit more complicated, is the fallacy of equivocation. This is where we equivocate on the meaning of a word, or we use a word in two different ways, and that leads us to believe something false. So here's the kind of textbook popular example. $1 is better than nothing. That seems true, right? Nothing is better than sex. Maybe that's true. Therefore, $1 is better than sex. Well, what's wrong with this? I mean, it seems obviously that this conclusion is false. But given the way that we've defined validity and soundness, it seems like it's a perfectly good argument, right? At least if you think these two things are true, you might even think this is a sound argument, because the premises are true. it seems like if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be. Why? Well, A is better than B, B is better than C, so A is better than C. That seems like a perfectly legitimate form of reasoning. However, here's the problem. This argument commits the fallacy of equivocation. Why? Because it uses the word nothing in two different ways. The argument doesn't go through because nothing means something different here than it means here. Think about that a little bit. I want to move on because this video has gotten quite a bit longer than I had anticipated. Okay, an important one, begging the question, also referred to as circular reasoning. This is when an argument makes a statement that is assumed to be true without evidence other than the statement itself. So here's an example. Barbara says, I think he's unattractive. Susan asks why. Barbara says, because he's ugly. Well, this is what Barbara's trying to convince us of, the conclusion, that he's unattractive. Susan asks for supporting evidence, or a premise, basically. And here's her premise. Well, the argument assumes what it's trying to prove in order to prove it. Barbara is trying to prove that somebody is unattractive by pointing out that he's ugly. That's begging the question, or circular reasoning, because the only evidence given is just exactly what Barbara's trying to prove. Here's a more sort of illustrative example. So Paul says God must exist, and Dan asks, how do you know? Paul says, well, because the Bible says so. Dan says, why should I believe the Bible? Paul says, because the Bible was written by God. Now, you can see that the problem here is that Paul's trying to prove that God exists, but ends up assuming that God exists in order to prove it. If you assume what you're trying to prove in order to prove it, that's a bad argument. Okay, a couple of remarks about begging the question or circular reasoning. I think I've already hit on all of this. You can review this if you'd like. One thing I wanted to say about this, actually I don't think I have it written up, but about begging the question is that sometimes in popular culture the phrase begging the question gets thrown around with a different kind of meaning. Like, someone might say, that's really interesting, it begs the question, why blah blah blah. What they mean is it raises the question, or it makes you wonder. But begging, it's unfortunate that that's the phrase gets used in that way in ordinary language, because it really is a technical term that just means circular reasoning as we've defined it here. So don't confuse that. And then the straw man fallacy is misrepresenting somebody's views so they can be more easily attacked. So here's an example if you want to pause it, but I'm moving on. In the appeal to ignorance, this is fascinating, but at this point I want to just get these on the table and let you read them and proceed. So pause it if you'd like. And the appeal to tradition, I don't think this mistake or this logical fallacy is committed as often as others. And false dilemma is interesting. You can pause that if you'd like, and likewise for hasty generalization. Slippery slope arguments. An interesting and timely example. Feel free to pause it if you want. Here's one kind of qualification or limit on slippery slope arguments. They're not all bad arguments, it just depends. So please do read that. And then the last two, there's fallacy of composition, and finally, fallacy of division. So I hope that you, during this last part, where I've been moving quite quickly, I hope that you have taken the time to pause and read these slides, because I just this one part of the video lectures for today has already gone 40 minutes, and that's too long. So I'm wrapping this up. We just had a lot to cover today. It won't be nearly as extensive in the future. Thank you for sticking with it. I hope that this proves useful for you. This is probably one slideshow that you might want to revisit before writing papers, or at least at some point throughout the class. I think it will really help you to have these basic tools in your philosopher's toolkit. But I guess I'll let you go. So have a good rest of your day.